Today marks the 14th anniversary of the tragic Samson Massacre, the deadliest mass shooting in Alabama history. On March 10, 2009, 28-year-old Samson and Kinston. He then headed east about 10 miles on Highway 52 and went on an hour-long shooting spree with two high-powered weapons in downtown Samson and a few of its neighbors. McClendon then headed to Geneva. He would kill a total of 10 before taking his own life. 6 others were injured. Geneva County Sheriff Tony Helms, who was then chief deputy, along with a game officer, were able to fire back at the suspect and kept him at bay, stopping his carnage. Helms would receive several heroic accommodations from the state legislature, governor's office, as well as other agencies. Helms says the united law enforcement response prevented the suspect from killing additional people.
It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of mild, deceptive day in southern Alabama where the air is thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. The sun felt warm on your skin, and the world seemed to settle into a rhythm of profound, unchallenged peace. For the close-knit residents of Samson, Kinston, and the surrounding Geneva and Coffee counties, the year 2009 had offered the quiet, predictable comfort of the expected. Life here was measured not by the anxiety of the outside world, but by the steady, dependable pulse of community, unwavering faith, and the deep, unspoken trust that keeps small towns whole. This was a place where keys were often left in ignition, where children played yards away from their parents, and where a stranger walking up to a front porch was almost guaranteed to be a friend. March 10, 2009. The clock was ticking toward 3:30 p.m. Across the heart of the community, folks were winding down their day. School buses had just dropped off children, screen doors were slamming softly, the sounds of backyard play were fading, and neighbors were sitting together on front porches, just sharing a sweet iced tea and a conversation. This fundamental human connection, this very basic sense of security, was about to be obliterated. Shattered by a force no one saw coming, an explosion of violence engineered meticulously from within their own quiet sphere. The first call that reached the Geneva County Sheriff's Department was delivered in a voice choked with pure, absolute terror. A frantic neighbor, struggling to breathe, screamed the unthinkable into the phone. "He's shooting! My God! He's killing everyone on the porch. There's a baby!" The dispatcher, struggling to process the raw, panicked details, could hear the continuing volley of gunfire in the background. It wasn't just panic. It was the sound of a community's fundamental trust being annihilated in real time. Within minutes, the police radio channels filled with desperate reports of multiple victims across multiple towns, the crisis escalating faster than law enforcement could initially comprehend. The shooter seemed to possess an impossible, phantom ubiquity, moving from street to street, house to house, executing his plan with chilling speed. Officers scrambled, coordinating across county lines in a chaotic attempt to find the source of the sudden, localized war. The devastation that followed would ultimately claim 10 lives in a spree lasting less than an hour, instantly etching an indelible, heartbreaking scar across the state of Alabama. But the true horror wasn't merely the volume of the dead, chilling as that number was. It was the intimate, sickening discovery of who was holding the gun, and the chillingly calculated nature of his actions. This was not an invasion by a stranger, a crime that could be dismissed as external tragedy. The violence was committed by one of their own, a man who simply walked up to the homes of his family and friends without ever needing to pick a lock. He possessed a twisted, logistical trail of bloodshed that suggested he wasn't acting in a temporary moment of madness. Rather, he was executing a cold, handwritten plan decades in the making, a final accounting of every perceived wrong he had ever suffered. The sheer premeditation stripped the crime of any claim to blind rage, replacing it with calculating, methodical terror. This is the story of Alabama's worst massacre, and the horrifying, agonizing question of how a lifetime of quiet emotional isolation and internal debt could turn a quiet neighbor into the state's deadliest executioner. The full, devastating truth of what was lost began not with a public eruption, but with a single, furious, final act of private betrayal in the dead of night. To fully grasp the monstrous actions of March 10, 2009, you have to look past the violence and deep into the life of the man who orchestrated it. He wasn't some unknown transient. He was a constant, quiet presence in Samson, a familiar face whose internal reality was utterly invisible to those around him. His name was Michael McClendon. Born in 1978, Michael grew up surrounded by the kind of deeply traditional, small-town values that place immense weight on tangible success, achievement, and unquestioning conformity. In a place like Samson, your worth was visible. It was measured by your job, your uniform, and the respect you commanded. After his parents divorced, he was raised primarily by his aunt and uncle, James and Virginia White. Respected, upstanding pillars of the community whose constant presence and evident success seemed to stand as a subtle, constant rebuke to Michael's own escalating failures. In his earliest years, Michael appeared to be the picture of the perfect child, polite to a fault, meticulous, and academically capable. Yet this polished exterior masked a crucial, crippling psychological truth. An intense, internalized fragility and an inability to tolerate failure or to process shame without projecting the blame entirely outward. The community's quiet expectations became Michael's crushing emotional burden. He didn't just want a job. He craved the structure, the profound validation, and the unquestioning respect that came with wearing a uniform. His clear, singular ambition in his late teens was a life in law enforcement or the military. He saw discipline and authority as the only way to impose order on the internal chaos of his own crippling insecurity. His mother, Lisa Carol White McClendon, remained the single most important person in his life. A bond that grew so intense it often looked less like healthy familial support and more like an unsustainable, fragile dependency. She was his one reliable shield against the judging world, and her approval was his only source of worth. Michael's pursuit of validation was immediately met with rejection, a series of reversals that became the open, festering wounds of his life. In 1999, his long-held dream of a military career collapsed entirely. He was discharged from the Marine Corps, and while the official reasons cited a chronic shoulder injury, the deeper truth soon followed. He had submitted fraudulent documentation to gain entry, a humiliating deceit he carried in secret. He was sent back to Samson, having failed to even start his adult life, carrying the deep scorn he felt from deceiving his family and his country. The Marine Corps discharge, the first major public failure, shattered his fragile self-image and solidified his belief that he was being unfairly persecuted by the system. He tried again in 2003, chasing the badge he desperately needed, enrolling in the local police academy. That second attempt ended even faster. Michael failed to complete the necessary training to pass the course, and the ultimate indignity soon followed. The town sent him a formal bill for $227. It was a demand for reimbursement for the training he hadn't completed. To him, this wasn't an administrative fee. It was public, documented, monetary proof of his profound inadequacy, a direct financial representation of his failure. This pattern of repeated rejection, the military, the police, the humiliating demand for money, created an emotional debt he refused to accept responsibility for. He didn't seek constructive help or vent his frustrations to friends. He simply retreated and began constructing an elaborate, internal narrative where the fault was never his own. The quiet, polite boy was long gone, replaced by a brooding account keeper who was about to call in the world's debt with extreme prejudice. He believed he was owed everything. The deep-seated rage that festered within Michael McClendon wasn't confined to the emotional setbacks of his youth. It metastasized into an active, growing poison throughout his employment history. As he drifted between monotonous, low-paying jobs at places like Reliable Products and later the poultry plant, Pilgrim's Pride, every professional setback, every word of criticism, was instantly cataloged not as standard workplace feedback, but as a malicious, calculated act of personal betrayal. In his mind, these companies, and the people running them, were not simply employers. They were agents of the system actively conspiring to destroy his future, deny him respect, and keep him small. He harbored a unique, venomous form of resentment. A supervisor asking him to work faster, a colleague questioning his efficiency, or a simple pay deduction for a missed shift. These minor, Everyday frictions were mentally transformed into monumental assaults on his character. He couldn't process these events constructively. He could only process them as evidence of the world's deep unfairness and his own victimhood. This inability to accept responsibility meant these professional grievances were not merely brushed aside. They were obsessively documented and filed away for future use. When investigators finally searched the wreckage of his life after the massacre, they uncovered the single, most chilling piece of evidence against him. A 4-page composition notebook. On those lined pages, Michael had constructed a meticulous, personal ledger of scores he believed needed settling. This wasn't the rambling confession of a man losing his mind. It was an operational blueprint. The pages were carefully divided into precise columns: the offender, the grievance, and the final unspoken retribution. Names of former supervisors, colleagues who had questioned his work ethic, and others who had simply existed in his sphere of resentment were all carefully listed, often accompanied by terse, judgmental annotations justifying their future fate. An investigator, describing the disturbing find, later reported, "It wasn't a rambling letter. It was a cold, hard account book." He treated every perceived wrong as a financial debt that needed to be collected with finality, and he saw himself as the only rightful executor of the will. This cold, methodical documentation erased any doubt that the massacre was a spontaneous eruption. It was a years-long, carefully executed project finally coming due. But a project of this magnitude required a flashpoint, a final, undeniable justification to commence. That devastating spark arrived in early March 2009. Michael had abruptly quit his latest job at Kelly Foods, cutting his last formal tie to the world of employment. The ultimate, devastating blow, however, came on March 8th, when his mother, Lisa McClendon, the singular emotional bedrock of his small, tightly controlled universe, was suspended from her long-time job at Pilgrim's Pride. In Michael's profoundly distorted perception, the world that had rejected him years ago was now moving to destroy the only person he truly cared for, the only person who offered him unconditional human warmth. The suspension, whether justified or not, was the ultimate violation that shattered his last connection to rational thought. It collapsed the remnants of Michael's self-control and cemented his warped justification for mass revenge. He convinced himself that the only way to achieve justice was through annihilation. Within 24 hours, the quiet accounting shifted from the scratching of a pen to a decisive, irreversible commitment. On the evening of March 9, 2009, the day before the world changed forever, Michael was seen making a large bulk purchase. The quiet man who had spent a decade compiling a list of names was now acquiring the rifles, the heavy ammunition, and the logistical means necessary to erase them all. The debt was finally due, and the price was about to be paid in blood across 3 separate communities. The final, terrible accounting began not in the daylight of his grudge matches, but in the deepest quiet of the night, on Tuesday, March 10, 2009. Michael McClendon had spent decades compiling a ledger of external debts. Now, he chose to pay the one debt that mattered most to himself by destroying the singular person who had anchored his entire life. He drove to the home in Kinston, Alabama, where his mother, Lisa Carol White McClendon, slept. She was the one reliable shield, the one person he claimed to be protecting from the world's perceived injustices. The ultimate, horrifying expression of his twisted logic was to extinguish the object of his dependency before destroying everything else, a final, complete gesture of control. He moved through the house in the dark, a figure of terrifying, chilling precision. Investigators later determined Lisa was shot and killed as she slept. It was an execution devoid of human connection, a final, complete abandonment of the person who had been his only emotional anchor. The act was monstrous, yet it was followed by a chilling contradiction of care. Michael carefully placed his mother's body on the living room couch and gently covered her with a blanket. This bizarre, final gesture, a misplaced tenderness that masked the immense brutality of the murder, was a sign of a mind utterly fractured, attempting to impose an artificial sense of peace and order onto an act of ultimate chaos. He then killed the 3 family dogs, the last living witnesses to his crime, and set the small Kinston house on fire, walking away into the pre-dawn darkness. It was a calculated action meant to conceal his involvement, designed to make the tragedy appear as a devastating, accidental house fire that claimed one life. But Michael's true manifesto, his written attempt to justify the unfolding horror, was already in motion. Before the sun rose, he drove to a nearby mailbox and deposited a sealed package addressed to a family member. Inside was the final, 4-page letter, a sick testament to his self-pity and rage. In it, he spun a dark tapestry of self-serving lies, claiming his mother had been suffering from an imaginary lung cancer and that he was simply ending her misery before ending his own. He wrote, "Mama didn't know what hit her. I've been miserable for a long time. This is better for us both." It was a grotesque attempt to frame murder as mercy, a final piece of self-deception from a man completely unmoored from reality, designed to manipulate the narrative long after he was gone and the bodies were discovered. The primary, public targets of the massacre, however, were still hours away. While firefighters raced to the burning home in Kinston and police treated the scene as a potential homicide concealed by arson, Michael drove toward Samson. He wasn't settling professional scores yet. He was settling his most immediate, personal debt against the family he felt had judged and dismissed as failures, the source of his aunt's quiet success that he envied, the Whites. At the White family home on West Geneva Street, Michael's aunt, Virginia White, and her husband, James White, were relaxing on their porch that afternoon, enjoying the fleeting calm of a sunny March day. They were joined by neighbors and other family members: Tracy Wise, Dean Wise, Andrea Meyers, and the most innocent victim of all, 18-month-old Karen Gracie Meyers. It was a casual gathering, a typical small-town scene, bathed in simple human connection and warmth. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Michael pulled up to the house. The quiet man who had spent a decade compiling a list of names stepped out, and without a word, without a moment of warning, the carefully controlled rage of years detonated. Armed with multiple high-powered rifles, he opened fire, instantly transforming the domestic tranquility of the front porch into a sudden, chaotic storm of violence. The devastation was absolute. He didn't fire wildly, he was methodical, an executioner operating by his own ledger. An eyewitness, a neighbor watching from across the street, later told the press with a voice trembling from the memory, he wasn't aiming at random. He was methodical. He chased one of the women into the house, killing her. It was execution. It was the most terrible thing I ever saw. The massacre was intimate, immediate, and utterly relentless, leaving 6 more victims lying where they fell, shattering the quiet heart of Samson in less than 60 seconds. Michael McClendon then drove away, his initial, calculated scores settled, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable grief and the absolute destruction of a community's peace. The annihilation at the White family porch was the second, devastating climax of Michael McClendon's personal reckoning, but the storm did not abate. It expanded rapidly, consuming the surrounding landscape and transforming the calculated act of revenge into an indiscriminate, terrifying campaign. In the immediate aftermath of that horrific 60 seconds, the killer didn't stop to survey his work. His mission was still incomplete. He simply got back in his vehicle and drove straight onto the streets of Samson and Geneva, turning focused murder into terrifying, random chaos, leaving behind a trail of death and confusion that defied comprehension. The rage that had been tightly focused on his family suddenly erupted against anyone in his path. This phase of the massacre, unfolding across multiple small towns, was defined by sheer, terrifying randomness and a total lack of human compassion. Sonia Smith, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, became a target simply for standing at a local gas station, caught in a spray of bullets from a passing vehicle. Then, James Starling, shot in the back as he desperately tried to run for his life. And Bruce Malloy, simply driving home from work, was caught in the cold, unfeeling crossfire of Michael's escalating spree. These latest victims held no place on the notebook's list of grievances. They were simply collateral damage, innocent citizens erased in a monstrous declaration of independence from the world he felt oppressed him. The violence had become an active, moving terror campaign, stretching the resources of local law enforcement to the absolute breaking point. as reports flooded the Geneva County Sheriff's Department. Reports of bodies on porches, vehicles riddled with bullet holes, and a lone figure in a vehicle speeding between towns. A chaotic, multi-jurisdictional manhunt was instantly launched. State troopers and local deputies converged on the area, attempting to locate the invisible enemy, a ghost of Samson who seemed to be everywhere at once. McClendon's vehicle was finally spotted, leading to a high-speed pursuit. The first officers to close and witness the killer, still fueled by absolute, destructive purpose, fire 7 rounds into a state trooper's windshield, injuring the officer but failing to stop the pursuit. It was a final, defiant act of war against the very uniform and authority he had always coveted and failed to achieve. Amidst the frantic, high-speed chase, one detail stands out as the cruelest stroke of dramatic irony, the true measure of that day's unseen devastation. Deputy Josh Meyers was among the officers in the initial pursuit of the killer's vehicle. Deputy Meyers was a dedicated lawman, responding instantly to the unfolding catastrophe gripping his community. He was a hero, fulfilling his duty to protect and serve, yet tragically, he was utterly unaware of the personal, crushing cost of that day's violence. The man Deputy Meyers was chasing, the shooter who had just wounded his colleague and brought Alabama to its knees, was the same man who had, minutes earlier, ended the lives of his beloved wife, Andrea Meyers, and their 18-month-old baby girl, Karen Gracie Meyers. He was risking his life to catch the very monster who had destroyed his world, a horrifying, unseen double burden of duty and devastating loss that defies description. The chase finally ended as police vehicles cornered Michael McClendon near his final, long-intended destination, the old factory building Reliable Metal Products, a place linked to a deep-seated workplace grudge. The killer pulled up to the building and stopped. The ensuing standoff was brief and decisive, as officers established a perimeter, preparing for a potential final, bloody gun battle. The sound of a single, final gunshot echoed from within the vehicle. Michael McClendon took his own life, bringing the 70-minute, chaotic rampage to an abrupt, final silence. The total toll of the massacre was officially counted. 10 lives extinguished and the communities of Samson, Kinston, and Geneva left in the wreckage of a horror that remains unparalleled in Alabama history. The physical chase was over, but the agonizing process of understanding why would only just begin. The final, agonizing silence that descended upon Geneva County was not the peace the community yearned for. It was the chilling, heavy quiet of utter devastation. As the perimeter was secured around Reliable Metal Products, the officers found Michael McClendon exactly where he had stopped, a self-appointed executioner who had called in his final, catastrophic debt. The 70-minute siege of southern Alabama was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The quiet man who had always sought order and control had, in his last act, delivered nothing but ultimate chaos. The physical wreckage was immediate and heartbreaking. 10 lives extinguished. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, neighbors, and 1 innocent baby girl. The communities of Samson and Kinston, built on generations of trust, suddenly found themselves staring into a void, asking the unanswerable question: how? How could a lifetime of small failures and unspoken resentments culminate in an apocalypse carried out by one of their own? The most profound, unbearable wound was borne by Deputy Josh Meyers, the man who had chased the ghost of destruction across county lines. A lawman doing his duty, a hero fighting the terror, returned only to find his own life had been utterly destroyed in the process. His wife, Andrea, and their daughter, Karen Gracie, were among the initial 6 on the porch, erased in the first minute of McClendon's fury. Josh Meyers' burden was the cruelest irony of all. A man running toward the fire, not knowing the fire had already burned down his home. It is a loss so profound it redefined the meaning of tragedy for the entire state. A scar on the soul of a community that understands sacrifice but had never before comprehended such intimate, unseen betrayal. In the days and weeks that followed, the search for a rational motive became an obsession. Investigators studied the 4-page composition notebook, McClendon's ledger of grudges, looking for the grand conspiracy or the momentary psychotic break. But what they found was worse than either: meticulous, cold-blooded resentment, a narrative of victimhood so deeply ingrained that every perceived slight, from a failed training course to a mother's workplace suspension, became justification for genocide. The massacre wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of accounting, a final, terrible settlement. Today, the names of the 10 victims are etched into the memory of southern Alabama, a solemn reminder of the day the light went out. Samson is a town that found resilience, helping rebuild the lives shattered by a single man's pathology. Yet, the deep, fundamental trust that once defined life here, the ability to greet a neighbor without suspicion, was permanently damaged. The Alabama massacre stands as a terrifying testament to the silent, invisible danger of the internal world, a reminder that the quietest neighbor can sometimes be the one meticulously compiling a debt too monstrous to ever be repaid. The killer took his own life, ensuring he would never answer the central, haunting question. He closed his ledger, leaving behind only the wreckage of 10 lives and the unending, agonizing mystery of why a boy with quiet ambition chose instead to become Alabama's deadliest executioner. And that terrifying, final silence is the heavy legacy he left behind.